Good evening, guys. Here's the second video for Unit 8 on the atmosphere. We'll call this 8.2. If you were here last Thursday and last Wednesday, we kind of talked about the difference between heat and temperature. So here are those definitions again. I'm not going to read them to you. They're very important. Only thing I would add to heat is it says that heat can be transferred from an object to object. Let's remember that goes from a warmer object to a cooler object, not the other way around. We also mentioned on Thursday, if you were here, three kinds of energy transfer. Now, if you're already here on Thursday and you've already taken these notes, you don't have to take them again. Three ways to transfer heat: conduction by touch, convection by the movement of a hot fluid like water, liquid, or gas. So usually some sort of water or water vapor. In radiation, this is the method that gets the sun's energy 93 million miles across empty space. So what happens when you go from one basic state of matter to the next? This diagram leaves out plasma, because plasma is not one of your normal states of matter. So as I click this, it's going to fill in words on each arrow. So like, for example, what's gas to liquid or liquid to solid, and so on. So the first thing is, when you go from a liquid to a gas, that's evaporation. And in a minute, we're going to look about, is energy gained or is energy lost in these physical changes. And these are physical changes of states of matter. The next one is the reverse of that, condensation, when you go from a gas to a liquid droplet. When you go from liquid to solid, it's freezing, and of course the opposite of that's melting. When you go from gas to solid, there's something called deposition, and that's not a normal situation. Matter of fact, I've never seen it before. But sublimation is a little more common when you go directly from a solid to a gas and you bypass the liquid stage. I'll give you some examples of that in class. This rather complex looking graph is not really that bad at all. On the y-axis we have temperature, and on the x-axis we have heat, basically the energy in the form of heat. If you look at the curve, how the curve goes up and then levels, up and then levels and up, what they're telling you is that you go from a solid where the atoms are arranged in a neat, orderly pattern to liquid. It requires an increase in temperature. So you're going to add heat. Think about adding heat to an ice cube to melt it. The liquid portion, when you go from that to gas, when you're going, that's evaporation or vaporization, you're going to need even more heat, even more temperature to go from the liquid state to the gas state. And then just come back down and do the opposite. So when you're going from a gas to a liquid, you're actually giving up temperature, you're releasing heat. Hey guys, we're getting ready to start our last unit of the semester. This is going to combine photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So we're going to call this cellular energy. This is Unit 8. There'll be two videos. This is the first one because this will be Section 1. So there's learning targets. Please, please, please write these down. They're very important if you could use these to self-assess your way along the way. Okay, so before we talk about either photosynthesis or cellular respiration, let's talk about what cellular energy is. Every cell in your body has this chemical that it runs off of, kind of like gasoline powers a car, electricity powers a toaster. Okay, and this chemical is called adenosine triphosphate. And from this point on, we're going to call that ATP for obvious reasons. So the ATP molecule powers every single cell you have. So what we're going to learn first is the three parts of the molecule, and those are the adenosine part. That's this blue thing up here. It's a double ring structure. The ribose, which is a sugar. Remember, OSE easily indicates it's a sugar. And then the most important part of the molecule are these three phosphate groups, these three PO4 groups. And particularly this third group and the bond that holds it to the second group is very, very important. And this diagram down here is a little more complex drawing of the same thing, but of course it is backwards. It's flipped around. It shows you the actual atoms involved here. So this is the cartoon drawing. This is the actual atomic structure. So how does our cell do work using ATP? And so we get into this thing called the ATP ADP cycle. Now, I didn't repeat myself. ADP is very similar to ATP. The big difference is, and here's ATP, this diagram here, this molecule is exactly the same as either one of these. They just made it a little more simpler. So here's the adenosine part. That's these two parts right here. Okay? And then the 3 phosphates. This is the most important part. This right here is really not going to come into play at all. Okay, so the most important part of the 3 phosphates, particularly this phosphate and this phosphate, but most importantly the bond that holds those together. So if your body has ATP in it, your cells have ATP in it, and it wants to get energy from that ATP, this 3rd phosphate must be broken loose. So the bond holding that together, it's called a high energy bond. It's a special kind of covalent bond. The energy holding that together, once it's broken loose, is now available to do cell work. So when we break that bond, now we have just a single phosphate all by itself, not part of that molecule anymore, and energy is released. The energy that was holding it together between the 3rd one and the 2nd one is now released. That's this big starburst, and this is what's used to do cell work. What you're left with is adenosine diphosphate, where triphosphate meant 3 phosphates, diphosphate means 2. So this is kind of like a half-charged battery. So we've gone from a fully charged battery, we've used some energy, now your cell's doing work, your muscle cells are pumping, your heart cells are pumping, whatever, you're doing cell work, and you're left with an ADP molecule. So how do we turn this back into ATP? How do we charge the battery back up? Well, this comes from food. So all the energy in your food, so all your carbohydrates, your lipids, your proteins, and the bonds that hold the atoms together in those bonds are what we're going to break down through a big process called cellular respiration. And in the case of plants, photosynthesis also. We're going to extract the energy from the bonds of the atoms that are holding the bonds holding the atoms together in the food that you eat. And this energy will reattach the phosphate back to ADP and make ATP. And your cells do this continuous cycle over and over again. It's called the ATP-ADP cycle. So let's think about energy conversions. Remember that you can't destroy energy, you can't make energy. The only thing energy can be done is you can convert it from one form to the other. So if you look at the 2nd bullet, this is an example of how you convert energy in a car. Gasoline, which is a chemical, gets converted to fire. Basically there's an explosion in your car engine. This is heat energy. This explosion moves a piston, which turns a crankshaft. This is mechanical energy, and then you can trace it on back farther and farther and farther. Okay, but we're going from chemical to heat to mechanical, just in the car engine. And it's kind of the same in you. Your food is the chemical energy. The process of converting it into ATP produces some heat. That's what keeps your body temperature warm. Then we eventually lose that to the atmosphere. And then that ATP allows your body to do things like move your muscles or walk around or run or stretch. So it's kind of similar to what's happening in a car engine with gasoline. So now we come to the first big biological process in this class. Finally, it's only taken 3.5 months. We've finally gotten to some true biology. Photosynthesis, probably the most important process in biology of any living thing in the world. And you might think, well, okay, that happens in plants, right? How can that be the most important thing? Because without plants, we wouldn't exist. Now, I don't care if you eat your broccoli or not. If you don't have photosynthesis, the food chains collapse, your food sources go away, my food sources go away. We don't have to be vegetarians. The thing that eat the plants will eventually die themselves, and we will have no food. It might take a little while to get there, but we would eventually get there as a planet if plants were to go away. Now, plants aren't going to go away. We're safe. So let's break down this word, photosynthesis. Synthesis means to make. We've hit this several times. Okay, it means to put something together. Light, or photo, means light. That's all it means. So we're going to make something using light. This reaction is an endergonic reaction. This is that reaction that's going to store energy. It's going to build up energy as opposed to releasing energy. Most important here in the red is this overall equation for photosynthesis. I want you to write that down. I want you to write all this down, but I want you to particularly know this. This is very, very important. Photosynthesis doesn't occur in one chemical step. It occurs in two very complex steps that I'm going to try my best to simplify. Here's a photograph, a real photograph of real cells showing the cell walls of plant cells and the chloroplast. So all the other organelles, the mitochondria, the ER, those are not visible in this picture, but they are there. So the first set of reactions in the photosynthesis are the light-dependent reactions. So if you think about that, the light-dependent reactions, it is dependent upon light for them to happen. Of course, this light is sunlight. So if you look at the chloroplast, look at the parts of the chloroplast, I want you to understand those basic parts of the chloroplast. So when I talk about these, you can go back to this picture and look. So this occurs in the thylakoid membrane. The light-dependent reactions occurs in the thylakoid membrane. So these little discs, these stacks of discs called grana, each one of these little discs has a membrane in it, and these reactions occur in or on that membrane. So these thylakoids, each disc is a thylakoid. A stack of them is called a granum. Grana is plural. Grana are numerous, and they're surrounded by fluid. So all this gray area would be a fluid called stroma. So here's what sunlight does. Sunlight does a couple things. First of all, chlorophyll absorbs sunlight, and we'll talk about that in class. The power of the sunlight splits the water molecules into hydrogen ions and oxygen atoms. The oxygen quickly combine and form O2 molecules, and they're released to the atmosphere. So when we say plants make oxygen, this is how it does it. The sunlight also excites some electrons. This is not written down in the chlorophyll, and helps out the next process, which is the process of carrying these hydrogen ions to a different part of the chloroplast to be used in the next set of reactions. These hydrogen ions are going to be used to make ATP, which, remember, we talked about earlier is the energy molecule of cells. So here's a diagram of a chloroplast. Now I purposely blanked out the other side, the other set of reactions. We see water coming in from the roots of the plant. We see sunlight streaming in from space. Here's the thylakoid. These are the thylakoid disc, the granum. This is where all the action takes place. And remember, the things that come out of the light-dependent reactions are oxygen, ATP, and a molecule called NADPH. Let's just leave it at that. It's actually called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, and thank goodness for abbreviations, right? So this is a molecule that carries energy just like ATP carries energy. But not just like, but for purposes of this class, it'll be just fine to say that. Okay, so that's going to take us to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is a light-independent reaction. We don't need light to happen. Now, it doesn't mean it occurs in the dark. It means it just doesn't require light to happen. It's not dependent upon that. This is the part of the reaction in which the sugar is going to be made. And that's the whole purpose of the plant doing photosynthesis, is to make sugar. It's not to make us oxygen. We're grateful that they do, but it's to make sugar for itself. So it's going to use the NADPH and the ATP that was made in the light-dependent reactions, and it's going to use those through some complex chemical steps to convert carbon dioxide into glucose or fructose, basically sugars. So what happens is carbon dioxide enters the leaf through the atmosphere and finds itself into the chloroplast, and there's 6 of these. So these are 6 carbon atoms that are going to combine with all the hydrogens that the NADPH is carrying. The ATP is going to energize this, and we're going to produce a molecule of sugar. Now remember, this is not the formula for glucose. This is the relative ratio of CH and O atoms in sugar. So carbon dioxide, which is a really bad gas that contains carbon, is going to be fixed or converted into a usable carbon-based organic molecule called sugar. and this is what the plants live off of. So what are some things that can affect photosynthesis? Well, the amount of sunlight, obviously. The amount of water can severely limit how well photosynthesis works. There's always going to be enough CO2. But if that were to change, if you increase the amount of CO2, photosynthesis could occur faster if it had enough water and enough light. Chances are CO2 will never disappear. And that if it does, that's bad. I know right now we have too much of it, but if it disappears, then photosynthesis shuts down. And then temperature. It works better at warm temperatures. It works, but not too hot, and it works slower at cool temperatures, just like most enzymes, because all these reactions, and many of them I'm leaving out for this chapter, are enzyme controlled. Okay? So summary. Here's the whole diagram now. In the light-dependent reactions, it uses sunlight and water to power some set of reactions that produces O2 and some temporary products, ATP and NADPH. These two energy-carrying molecules, the NADPH and ATP, are used to power the Calvin cycle, which converts the carbon dioxide into sugars. And then when these two molecules get used up, they go get recharged again by the sunlight and the light-dependent reactions, and this process repeats. This side is dependent upon light to happen. This side doesn't need light to happen. Okay? And that's it, guys. Thank you.